And it's at the statutory level when you get this distinction between Oprah Winfrey and Jim Dobson. Because the part of the Internal Revenue Code dealing with charities, often called 501c3s, that's the part that says that 501c3s cannot endorse candidates at all. Flat prohibition on endorsing candidates. But they can do very limited lobbying on behalf of legislative issues. And when you read the case law on that, it's roughly if an organization, pick one, First Congregational Church, wants to lobby legislation, they can spend roughly 6 to 15% of their time and money on lobbying. And once they get over 15%, then they're really starting to get in questionable territory legally. And the risk is that they'll get their tax-exempt status pulled. All right, now when I say tax-exempt status, there are a number of benefits, but primarily the two that you're probably most familiar with are religious organizations, 501c3s, and not just religious organizations, but any charitable organizations that are 501c3s, most religious ones are, get kind of a double tax benefit. One, their income is not taxed, but two, any donations to them are tax deductible. So the bite, the risk to the churches, the 501c3s, is if they become active in politics, then they'll have their tax exemption revoked. Okay? Now let's be clear though, that's the sanction. Actually, if Jim White or Jim Dobson or anyone else wanted to push it, they have a constitutional right to speak on every political issue and endorse whatever candidate they want. But the price of that is losing their tax-exempt status. And that's a big price that most people are not willing to pay. Now, let's talk about the history. Well, where did that come from? Many of you probably know this too. Actually, it came from a campaign that Lyndon Johnson was in 1954. So Lyndon Johnson was running for Senate in 1954. He was running against a gentleman named Dudley Doherty. And apparently Mr. Doherty had a lot of support with the churches in Texas. And so Lyndon Johnson was getting beat up in the primaries as a Democratic primary. Getting beat up in the Democratic primaries by the churches who were supporting Dudley Doherty. And so Johnson introduced into legislation a limitation on charities being active politically. There's hardly any legislative history on this, but it was enacted. Now the interesting thing here is that nowadays we think of that, that 501c3 political limitation as kind of a quid pro quo, right? That 501c3s get the benefit of tax deductions, tax exemptions, but have to pay the price of not being active politically. But the ironic thing about that is prior to Johnson getting this passed, churches, 501c3s already had the tax deductions and the tax exemptions. So it wasn't like he enacted the quid pro quo into the legislation. They already had the benefit. He just put the cost on them. Okay. So back to my thesis. I think that religious folks shouldn't have this limitation. Why? Because I think the religious point of view is an important point of view that we should hear from in elections. And I look around at the national issues and the local issues. Wars, healthcare reform, immigration reform, national debt, the role of government in our lives, protecting the environment, developing an energy policy, how to educate our children, local issues, strong mayor, state and local funding, 6061, 101, Amendment 62, Amendment 63, development of the medical marijuana industry. All of these issues, from my perspective, would benefit from the religious perspective being represented and discussed within the public square, just like the media celebrity perspective, Oprah Winfrey's perspective, gets discussed, just like the scientific perspective, the business perspective, the military perspective, fiscal, historical. I mean, all these perspectives are perspectives that we hear about, but there's this limitation on the religious one. And you all know what happens. I mean, Jim Dobson is the king of this. One, he starts a PAC right, of his own, so that he can be religiously active through his PAC, or two, he does this fiction, which is when he wants to speak politically, he'll stand up in front of a group and say, I'm now speaking individually, as Jim Dobson, the individual, the citizen, and not as the former representative of Focus on the Family, right? Which was all just a fiction to try and get past this IRS code rule. Again, just to use one example, energy policy. You can look at energy policy through all different lenses. The political lens. What's possible to get done on energy policy? What advances the common good of America? Might be the political questions. Scientific. What's scientifically possible regarding our energy policy? Can we get cleaner coal scientifically? Can we get a cost-effective solar and wind? Can we get safer oil exploration? Can we do nuclear fission or fusion? The business perspective. Is a greener energy policy actually good for American business? The fiscal perspective. Should we raise taxes to pay for government-sponsored research and development for energy policy? Should we give tax credits for green businesses? Would either affect our national debt? The military perspective. Does lower dependence on foreign oil mean our military can actually leave the Middle East? If we changed our energy policy and got less dependence on foreign oil, would we be able to change or end the two wars that we're fighting? Now, all of those, I think, are valid perspectives that we should have when we're considering, as a country, an energy policy. But also, I think we should have the perspectives of religious voices. How does God ask us to steward the earth? Does our current energy policy exact too high a cost on the world that God gave us to care for, or on those in direct proximity to the energy extraction and development businesses? Both Bill and Linda spoke eloquently to the numerous religious issues and perspectives that confront the political issues that we're currently dealing with in our country. Okay, so just in the last few minutes, I haven't taken too long already, I'll talk just a few minutes about what I think are some of the objections to having more of a mix of politics and religion. One objection, I think, is that some people say that religion is irrational, right? When you get a statement like, God, especially from a minister, right? God told me that you, my congregation, should all vote for this candidate. I mean, how do you rebut that? How do you respond to that? Yeah. Well, I say even if ministers are going to make those sorts of comments, those sorts of comments are, I think, in our society only as believable as the person saying them. In the same way that if Oprah says, hey, I think all of you should vote for this candidate over here, you're going to get a lot of people that follow her, you're going to get a lot of people that dissent from her. Most people are going to say, well, Oprah, give me some reasons before I'll go along with you and decide to vote for this candidate. I think the same is going to be true, by and large, for the minister that makes a statement like that. My point is, I think, while some religious discussion might be irrational, is probably too strong a word, unsuited for the public square, unable to really have a debate about, I think a lot of it is, and a lot of it can be. You can have people on the left and the right discuss the meaning of the Bible very fruitfully. And I think that should happen in our political debates. Okay, a second objection, which I think is often raised, is, well, if we go down this road, Eric, we're going to get more religious strife. And our founders knew, our founders were good historians, and they knew that mixing religion into government created religious wars. Okay, well, my response there is, having religion in politics, I think, is a good thing. Having a religious government, I agree, that's a bad thing. And I think the Establishment Clause protects us from a theocracy, as Phil, I think, criticized numerous times. We don't have a theocracy in this country. But I think it's possible to have the religious perspective presented in politics, and even religious people going to the state houses in our country, and yet not have a religious government. Because someone can go to Congress and say, I think this energy policy is a good one, and here are all my secular reasons, and oh, by the way, I also happen to be a Christian, and I think it's the way we should steward God's earth. And that's just fine. Now, that person can't interject that religious reason as a reason for passing the legislation.